I'm going to go ahead and review a couple of translation practice problems. These are not the same practice problems that I have given you, but I'm hoping that these practice problems that I am about to review will help you get a jump start on those independent practice problems. Let's look at the first question. This question states that a triangle on a coordinate plane is translated according to the rule t, which represents our translation, -8 and +4. Well, this is a function rule. We know this is a function rule because it follows the function rule format. Okay, we are being asked to determine what is another way to write this rule. Well, we learned that we can represent translations two different ways, using a function rule, which we started with, and a mapping rule. So, we are going to create a mapping rule as another way to write this rule. Let us remember that mapping rules take the form Now, we can use our function rule to create a mapping rule. How would we do that? Well, we are already in our function rule given information about what will happen at A and what will happen at B. So, we can take that function rule and create a mapping rule by determining, because we have a -8 in the function rule, we will have x minus 8. And because we have a +4 in the function rule, we will have y plus 4. Here is the mapping rule that we just created. In our answer choices, we are looking for the mapping rule that follows this format. C is the only mapping rule that is exactly similar to the mapping rule that we just created. Therefore, C is our answer choice. Let us go ahead and look at our next problem. This problem states that a rectangle on a coordinate plane is translated 5 units up and 3 units to the left. Well, we have been given information about how our translation or how our image is going to move. We have been told that we're going to move 5 units up and 3 units to the left. Well, we know that when we move up, we must use B to represent a movement vertically up or down. Because we are moving up, we must use a positive B. B in this instance would be 5, so we would use a +5. We know that in order to represent a horizontal movement, we would use A. Because we are moving to the left, we would use a -A. In this instance, we have been given information that we're moving 3 units to the left, so we would use a -3. Let us look at the question being asked. We are being asked to determine what rule describes this translation. And all our answer choices are taking the mapping rule form. So we want to create a mapping rule out of the information that we have. Okay, well, we know mapping rules typically take the form of this. Well, given the information that we've just been told, we know what the value of B is and what the value of A is. So we would just substitute that into the mapping rule. So we would get we would put a -3 because we know that A in this instance is -3. And and we would keep the b positive because we know in this instance we have a plus b. Therefore, we have created our mapping rule. Looking at the answer choices, we can determine that C resembles this mapping rule that we just created. Let us look at this next question. This question states that the rule as a mapping rule for the translation of a rectangle is, there's our mapping rule. The question is asking us to determine which of these statements best describes that mapping rule. Well, let's look at the mapping rule. We can see that the rectangle is being translated 2 units horizontally. More specifically, because we have a -2, we know that we are moving to the left. 2 units. We can see that we are also doing a translation vertically. More specifically, we are moving up. We are moving up 7 units. So our translation should say that we have a translation 2 units to the left and 7 units up. Let's see which of these statements matches that description. A translation of 2 units down. Well, we know we are actually moving 2 units to the left, so that is incorrect. Let's look at the next one. A translation of 2 units down. Once again, we know we are moving to the left, so that is incorrect. A translation of 2 units to the right. Well, once again, we have already identified that we are to move 2 units to the left. Let's look at D. A translation of 2 units to the left and 7 units up. That is exactly what we identified in the mapping rule, so we know that D is our answer choice. Let us look at this next problem. This problem gives us a diagram and asks us to determine which rule represents the translation from the pre-image, parallelogram ABCD, to the image parallelogram A', B', C', and D'. Well, the first thing we would do is identify that pre-image and the image. We know that this blue parallelogram is our pre-image and this red one is our image because only the images contain those prime notations. Okay, once we have identified that, the first thing that we should do is go ahead and label a vertex. Let's start with vertex A. So let us identify where vertex A lies on the pre-image, and we can determine that A is located at -4 and 4. And then let's locate vertex A' on the image. We can see that A' is located at -2 and 5. Wonderful. So we have determined that the vertex A of the pre-image is mapped to A' in the image. Now that we have done that, the next thing that we should do is determine what have we added or subtracted to the x to get from -4 to -2. Well, in order to get from -4 to -2, we might add a +2 original coordinate of x. What does this look like? Well, it looks like us taking the original coordinate of A, adding 2, and arriving at the coordinate of the image, -2. So we can determine that in order to get from -4 to -2, we must add 2. Well, in a function rule, this would look like T2. Well, Just given this information, we can knock out a couple answer choices. We can knock out A, because this says that we have a positive 1 when we in fact have a positive 2, and B, because this states that we have a positive 1 when we in fact have a positive 2, and even C, because this says we have a negative 2 and we in fact have a positive 2. So we could clearly pick D. However, I want to review how did we get that Y is equal to a positive 1. Well, all we simply have to do is do the same thing that we just did for X. We must determine what we must add or subtract to get from 4 to 5. We know that we can simply add 1 to the original Y to get to our translated Y. What would this look like? Well, it would look like us taking 4, adding 1, and getting to our vertex A prime at 5. Therefore, we know that we had a translation of 1. So we had a translation, we had a T translation of 2 units to the right and 1 unit up. As we can see, D matches that answer choice, and so D is in fact our answer. Let's move on to the next question. This question states that a rectangle ABCD has vertices A, B, C, and D. The rectangle is translated so that the coordinates of the image are A prime, B prime, C prime, and D prime. So we are given the coordinates of each vertex of the pre-image rectangle and the image rectangle. Using that information, we are being asked to determine what rule would be used to translate the image. Well, what I would do first is identify one vertex that I want to start with. Let's say I want to start with A. So I would mark the coordinates of the original vertex A, and I would write down the coordinates of the translated vertex A prime. Right? So I know that the original A was translated to create A prime. Well, given that information, I am being asked to determine what is added or subtracted from the original coordinate to get to our resulting coordinate. So what do we add or subtract to -6 to get to -10? Well, one way to get from -6 to -10 is to go ahead and subtract 4. If we take -6 and subtract 4, we get -10. So we already know that we have a function rule of t -4. Again, just knowing that information, we can cross out a few answers. And that is answer choice C and D, because answer choice C and D contain a positive 10 when we are looking for -10. So now let's identify what we must do to the y coordinate to get from -2 to 1. So again, we start with our original coordinate -2, and then we are trying to identify what we add or subtract to get to our resulting coordinate 1. Well, in order to get from -2 to 1, we can go ahead and add 3. So if we take the original coordinate -2 and add 3, we can get our resulting coordinate 1. Therefore, our function rule would now look like translation, -4 and +3. Well, as we can see here, the only answer choice that follows that function rule is A, so A is in fact our answer choice. Let us begin looking at another type of problem. This problem states, which statements are true about triangle ABC and its translated image A prime, B prime, C prime? Select two options. So right off the bat, we know that we are only to select two options and put a check mark on only two of these boxes. Okay, the next thing we should do is identify, once again, what the pre-image is and what the image is. Once again, we know this is our image because it contains that prime notation, so that's what happens after the translation. Okay, let's look at the first statement. The rule for this translation can be written as translation -5 positive 3, or add 3. Okay, well, an easy way to determine if this is a justifiable transformation function rule is to actually, because we have the diagram, is to go ahead and identify what this is telling us. This is telling us we have a translation 5 units to the left and 3 units up. So let's take a vertex. Let's start with vertex B, and let's also identify that vertex on our image, vertex B. Well, the easiest way to determine if this is in fact the rule for translation is to actually do what it says to do. So let's move 5 units to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, we can already see that we are off that coordinate grid. And so if we were to move 3 units down, well then our vertices should have been at this location. That is not true, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that that is not a true statement, so we will not be adding a check mark there. Great. Now, let's look at the next statement. This statement states that the rule for the translation can be written as translation +3, -5. Well, we know that when we have a positive A, we are to move to the right. So again, we will move 1, 2, 3. And because we have a -5, we know we are moving 5 units down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As we can see, upon making the translation of 3 units to the right and 5 units down, we have in fact arrived at our vertex. Therefore, this is in fact a correct answer. However, we can also double check this just to be sure. The way that we can double check this is to identify where that original vertex lies. So B lies at -1 and 1. And our vertex after the translation lies at 2 and -4. Right? So given that information, we are being told that if we add 3 to -1, we'll get 2, which is true. And if we subtract 5 from 1, we will get -4, which is also true. So therefore, that is in fact our rule of translation. Well, now that we know that that is our function rule, let's look at the other statements. The rule for the translation can be written as the mapping rule, x + 3 and y - 3. Well, we have already been given our function rule, which if mapped would actually look like that. And because that mapping rule does not follow this original function rule, well then this mapping rule is incorrect, and that is not a correct answer choice. Let's look at our next rule. The rule for the translation can be written as x - 3 and y minus 3. Well, again, we have already identified our mapping rule, and therefore that is not a property of our translation. Let's look at the final statement. This statement states the triangle ABC, or the preimage, has been translated 3 units to the right and 5 units down. Well, we know in order to have a translation of 3 units to the right, we must have a positive 3. And in order to have a translation of 5 units down, we must have a negative 5, which we do in fact have in our function rule and in our mapping rule. So therefore, that is our other correct answer choice. Now that we have 2 options selected, we know that we can move on. Let us look at another type of problem that we might encounter. This problem states the triangle ABC is translated according to the rule, and we have been given our mapping rule. If the coordinates of the pre-image of point B are at 4 and negative 5, what are the coordinates of B prime? Well, so we've been told here a lot of information. But let's first start by writing down our vertex locations. So we know that our pre-image vertex of B is located at 4 and negative 5, and we know that we are going to use our mapping rule in order to identify our coordinates of our vertex B prime after we complete that translation, right? And so we've also been giving information about what our translation would look like. We know that we have to add 2 to x, and we have to subtract 8 from y. So let's look at x. X is at 4, and so we know if we add 2 to 4, we will get 6. So our vertex B prime is at 6, right? Okay, and then we also know that we have to subtract 8 from y to find our y coordinate of our B prime vertex, and that will give us negative 13. So we know after doing that our vertex of B prime should be located at 6 and negative 13, which is D. Therefore, we have found our answer choice. In the previous problem we just saw, we were already given the coordinates of our vertex. But in this instance, we are just given a diagram and being asked to identify if a translation 2 units horizontally to the right and negative 7 units vertically down is applied to the pre-image ABC. What are the coordinates of B prime? Well, again, we are looking for the coordinates of B prime, but we have not been given the exact coordinates of our original B. So we're going to locate the B vertex and identify that B is located at 1 and negative 5. Wonderful. Now that we've done that, we know that we have a specific translation, more specifically this translation on the top, which will help us find the exact coordinates of B prime. So we are trying to identify what B prime is. Well, that function rule tells us that we will add 2 to our original x, which will give us 3, and that we will subtract 7 from our original y, which will give us negative 12. So we know that B prime is located at 3 and negative 12. And that is our answer choice D. Before we conclude, I want to introduce one more type of question that you might see. This question states the triangle ABC was translated according to the rule translation 4.5 units to the left and 6.2 units down to form our image A prime, B prime, C prime, as shown. What are the coordinates of point C of the pre-image? Well, here we can tell that we have actually been given our image and not our pre-image. And in fact, we are being asked to find our pre-image coordinates of point C rather than our image coordinates of point C. So in order to do this, we would identify the coordinates of C prime. C prime is located at -1 and -3. And what we're going to do is actually identify what was our C originally before our translation. Well, we have been given our translation rule of what took place from the pre-image to the image. And so in order to find the coordinates of our pre-image, we must work backwards. So instead of t positive 4, we had t negative 4.5. And instead of negative 6.2, we would have a positive 6.2. That allows us to work backwards and retranslate this image back to our pre-image. So we would take -1 and subtract 4.5, which would give us -5.5. And we would take -3 and add 6.2 to give us a positive 3.2. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that this is our location of our pre-image point, C. And that coordinate matches to our answer choice C, and so C is our answer. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that you use these practice problems examples to help you prepare for your Unit 2 exam or help you to prepare for your Unit 2 Lesson 2 independent practice problems.